Welcome to the State of Accessibility podcast from TPGI on LinkedIn Live. I am Mark Miller, and this is my co-host, Dr. David Sloan, Chief Accessibility Officer for TPGI, co-author of What Every Engineer Should Know About Digital Accessibility, a user research specialist, and the keeper of specialist knowledge of inclusive user experience design applied to educational technology.
And Mark is the sales director for TPGI, a member of the W3C Web Accessibility Initiative, Accessible Platform Architecture's Working Group Accessibility Maturity Model Task Force. We've got to make that task force name shorter for next time around, Mark.
We'll work on it. We'll work on something. David, welcome. Thank you for joining me on another podcast here. This is our third podcast, and the first two have gone great, and I just love doing this with you.
Yeah, I can't believe it. I thought, wow, is it really a month since the last time we did this? And the answer is no, it's not a month because we did it on the 24th last month. So yeah, it is a short time, but time does fly.
Yeah,
Lots of stuff happened since then.
It's so much fun. We love doing it. It's great that it came up quick this time. Well, and it's nice too, because this is starting to get into the busy season. So I'm really excited to update people. And today is a particularly good and special day for doing this podcast because it is World Usability Day, right? And so really, I would love to just start off with you talking about World Usability Day, and particularly, like, some people may be wondering, some people may not, but why is that an important day in the accessibility industry?
Yeah, so World Usability Day, I guess it's nice that it's kind of 6 months apart from Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which is middle of May each year. So here we are, middle of November, World Usability Day, and it's really a day where we can kind of promote the importance of usability and all of the usability as a product quality and all of the approaches that we can take to maximizing the usability and usefulness of the digital products that we are involved in building. So it's 20 years, or this is the 20th one, so it's like 19 years since the first one. Wow. So the first one happened in 2005 as an event organized by the Usability Professionals Association, which has since become the User Experience Professionals Association, UXPA for short. And I looked this up in Wikipedia, as any sort of researcher would start with.
Professional podcast.
Any professional researcher would do. And there's a really cool thing in the definition of World Usability Day. So yes, it occurs annually to promote the values of usability, usability engineering, user-centered design, universal usability, which we're going to come back to. And also, and I've bolded this in my notes, every user's responsibility to ask for things that work better. And this is something that right from the beginning, when I was a kid, I didn't really like computers. I wasn't that into technology because so often stuff was too hard to use. And I thought it was my fault. I thought I was just incompetent at using tech. And a lot of people that, family members, friends, apart from those who were really into programming and doing stuff, right. I thought I just don't get technology. And there are millions and millions and millions of people out there who would feel the same way, I'm sure, not realizing that the reason that we feel incompetent in using technology is because it's not designed with our needs in mind. So this is kind of flipping, almost giving us a responsibility. If you use tech, say, make it easy for me to use. I expect it to be usable. I mean, obviously, depending what the technology is, it may require some specialist knowledge. But in general, if I have the knowledge, if I'm part of the target audience, I should be able to use this without really struggling, and making people aware that stability is something you should expect rather than feel, well, I've got to read the manual, or I've got to go in a training course or do a degree in computing science to be able to use this. And I love that.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I think we've come a long way. And it always makes me think of, I think it was somewhere in the early 2000s, there was a Saturday Night Live skit about the IT guy, right? And somebody would be having trouble on their computer, and the big kind of joke was he'd always go, move, right? And the person would move, and he would sit down, and you hear him like on the person's keyboard. It's like all you had to do is press Control F9 and then Shift F4, and this, you know what I mean? And but it was a highlight to me that these people who were into technology and wanted to learn shift, control alt delete, shift F9 for, task, all these things. Um, they could do that, and they became these people with specialist knowledge who were showing you how to do just normal everyday things that you should be able to do. And we're past that, right? Like we
Mm,
don't, I mean, if I think about now, like I've worked for years at home on my own system. I've never seen an IT guy, right? Like I'm not calling them, they're not telling me to get on my seat. And back when I was working in the 2000s, and I considered myself kind of a tech nerd, and I like to use stuff, learn how to learn my technology for sure. But that proverbial, move and somebody getting on my keyboard is happening on a weekly basis.
hmm.
And that's just, that's one scenario. And I also think about it in terms of my mom, who's in her 80s, she figures technology out now. So for as long as the distance we still may have to cover is pretty long, I think, to improve usability. But we've come a long way at the same time. If somebody from my mom's generation, and my mom even says I'm not good at this, and then she goes and figures it out, there's got to be some improvement around
Yeah,
usability.
for sure. I mean, I think since 2005, information and communication technologies become so much more ubiquitous, especially with the emergence of smartphones and tablets, where we're
Yeah.
carrying tech around with us. But still, there's, when anytime there's a new version of a piece of software that we might have become familiar with using, at least the stuff we need to know in order to do the
Yep.
things we need to do, new version comes along, things have changed, new functionalities appeared, and what you the knowledge you had is no longer accurate. You've got to figure out a new way of doing something. So why did they change things? So there's still this pressure to add more rather than simplify what already exists or preserve whatever already exists. And that makes usability more of a challenge.
Yeah, and I don't think we suffer that that capability delta anymore when something changes. And what I mean by that is if it's mission critical at work for you, it doesn't matter if you're into technology or not. You're like, I just need to get this done. I don't have time to relearn the system. Or if it's something you do every day, like maybe you're traveling, and that you're like, I just need my plane ticket, right? Like I can't
Hmm.
figure out how to reuse an app, or fill in the blank with a bunch of things that we rely on technology for nowadays. I think that that's where that's changing, is that it's now just that thing that you need to do something with. And even if you do like getting in and figuring something out, those everyday things aren't what you want to figure out. You want to get to
Right.
your bank balance, you want to get to your plane ticket, you want to get to whatever it is you have to do at work, and you want it to be logical and easy to figure out.
Yeah.
Completely agree.
So I think the fact that this year's theme for World Usability Day is designing for a better world is kind of appropriate given what we've been talking about. Tech
Hmm.
really needs to exist to make it easier for people to do things, make it more efficient, avoid us wasting time, allow us to do things without making mistakes or requiring specialist knowledge. And this better world is also one that reduces exclusion, which makes it very relevant to
Right.
digital accessibility because of the close connection that exists between accessibility and usability. I mean, ultimately, people with disabilities want usable and useful digital products just like anyone else. People with disabilities need accessibility, but ultimately, it's well, okay, I can access thing, but can I use it? Is it useful to me? And that's what we're trying to achieve.
I think a simplistic definition of digital accessibility is usability for people with disabilities. it's really usability, and we're making sure we're including everyone, and maybe even people who need to interact differently than we do, or different than what might be considered to be normative or something like that, considering all different groups and the way that they need to access. So it's really not even tied together. It's like, you know, dis um accessibility is part of the whole that is usability in my mind, or should be. That's how we should be thinking of it.
I think that's a good way of looking about it. Ultimately, usability focuses on whether your target audience can interact and use the product with efficiency, effectiveness, and satisfaction. It's kind of a sort of formal uh, definition that's come from a standard from way back. And that target audience includes people with disabilities. So ultimately, usability is about maximizing use for your target audience. Accessibility, there's aspects of removing barriers that are associated with accessibility needs. And there's also always that kind of influence or specter of legal obligations to avoid
Right.
discrimination because of disability. But even then, when I was looking at the European Accessibility Act text and the accessibility requirements there, and I remembered it from something that Susanna Lawrence said in her session at Enabling, EAA requirements that products and services are designed in such a way as to maximize their foreseeable use by persons with disabilities. So I didn't really talk about accessibility so much as
Right.
maximize use by people with disabilities. So that's what the EAA wants people covered by the or organizations covered by the Act to
And
aim for.
it's truly a statement of equality, right? Because that's
Hmm.
what, if we think about usability, that's what we're thinking about, is that statement could be applied to just overall concept of usability. And this is saying, yeah, just the same thing. People with disabilities, same thing.
Yep, yep. And if you only think about accessibility as this kind of separate compliance effort, and then usability is for other people, then your accessibility efforts are almost futile because a product might be technically just about accessible, but if it's not usable, if it takes somebody using a screen reader forever to listen to all of the extraneous content, the extra information that someone's added in a misguided attempt to try and provide usability, then you end up almost being counterproductive. So accessibility and usability both align, and then they sit under this overall umbrella of user experience, this kind of broader, more subjective experience of interacting with a product and the organization that provided it. What ultimately we want as positive an experience as possible.
Right.
Again, depending on what the experience is, if it's a sort of a more we often talk about enjoyment, but then I think about the when you're thinking about I need information to allow me to um, understand where the emergency room is in a hospital in a town that I'm not familiar with. I don't want to enjoy that process. I just need the information
He doesn't want it to work really, really well. And
because a family member's sick
yeah,
and I need to help them. So we've got to be careful with what are those words that are associated with user experience, but still user experience is this kind of umbrella thing that connects accessibility and usability, and that's important for everybody, regardless of disability.
yeah, I mean, those are all really good points. And I think, even if we think about the effort that a lot of large organizations go through, where they start looking at accessibility as something they suddenly have to deal with, and it's a project and all that. And a subject that you and I, David, come across together a lot is this shift left,
Hmm.
bring the
Hmm.
organization. And the bottom line of that is, well, you've got a usability practice. Make sure that the accessibility part of that is also a piece of it, because it's just usability extended out to its maximum. I don't know what you would say, meaning. So given that, like, if like what do people turn to when they start to think about this usability for people with disabilities that we call accessibility? Because it is not always how people are thinking of it, and it's not
Mm.
always included in how people develop digital products. Becoming more and more so, but there's still work to do it. So if you're out there and you're like, well, that's great. We do usability, but how does this accessibility piece blend in? Then what do we start to look at that point?
Oh, there are so many things, and one thing I want to draw people's attention to, or remind people of the value of a document that's often focused on in accessibility efforts, the World Web Consortium's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We talk a lot about the
I've
success
heard of those.
criteria.
I've heard of those before,
Oh,
David.
I'll tell you about that afterwards. But
Yeah.
yeah, WCAG as a reference, we often focus on the success criteria. These are testable criteria to help us figure out if we've met specific accessibility requirements. But if we step up a level to the guidelines, you would very rarely talk about the guidelines of WCAG. We talk about the
Mhm.
success criteria. But when you look at the 13 guidelines in WCAG, several of them, most of them, arguably all of them, are about usability. Um, so I'm just going to read out a few just to illustrate the point. Um, Guideline 1.3, adaptable. Create content that can be presented in different ways, for example, similar layout or simpler layout, without losing information or structure. That sounds like usability.
Yeah.
Provide users
Oh,
enough time to read and use content. Sounds like usability. Make text content readable and understandable. Sounds like usability. Help users avoid and correct mistakes. That sounds very like usability. So even our accessibility reference is giving us usability
yeah.
advice. So,
That's super interesting, and this is the place to start, right?
yep.
And this is a great example of again, I don't even know if it's the intersection, but how accessibility is already a part of usability,
Hmm.
really. In that it's how would you write these guidelines any other way other than for them to sound like just usability, right? I mean, it's really like you know, you could add four people with disabilities to the end of each one of these, you know,
Hmm.
to make
Hmm.
it more clear, but that's not necessary. It's just saying this is what a usable product looks like, and it doesn't matter who your audience is, this is the experience that they should have.
Yeah. And
Um,
it shows the power of WCAG as a resource to help in the
sure.
creation of usable digital resources. And this is a point that, and forgive me if I've mentioned this blog post before by Eric Eggert, but I probably will be referring to every podcast because it's so helpful, where he talks about this distinction between guidelines and guardrails, where the guidelines help you stay in the middle of the road, keep you
Hmm.
away from trouble, head you in the right direction. The guardrails are at the side of the road, stopping you from driving your car down
Edge.
a steep slope or whatever, keeping you away from trouble. And the success criteria are the guardrails. They are the kind of the difference between accessible and not, but stay in the middle and use the guidelines to keep you headed in the right direction. And it's a really helpful way of
Really good
looking at the
analogy.
dual purposes
Yeah.
of WCAG.
My favorite here is 3.1. Make text content readable and understandable.
Yeah,
Of course.
it's
Probably
almost
useless to have a website with understand, you know what I mean? But it sounds obvious, but it's a great, like I guess the analogy you just gave, it's a great reminder to keep you in the center of the road when you're
yeah.
developing. Yep.
And that's again, it's all usability is all in the context of use. It's readable and understandable by the target audience for the intended purpose of the the product or service or whatever it is you're building. So if you're designing a decision support tool for a doctor to use in a surgery, you're going to assume that somebody has an advanced level of medical knowledge, but they're still going to be really busy and stressed because they have a limited
Right.
amount of time to consult with a patient who may be distressed, who may be, literally in very sick and unwell, and it's almost literally a life or death situation. So making it content readable and understandable for somebody, even with that specialist knowledge, is still super important.
So if you were to think about this, just thinking through this a little bit, David, because it's almost an awareness thing, right? Somebody who's got usability in air quotes, but not accessibility. It's largely because it's not integrated into the practice. It's not something that has been brought to their attention. Is there a group, even within all of that, is there a group that you think is almost like what would you say is the group that's the most difficult or to kind of consider or that people tend to misconsidering, until it is brought to their attention?
Uh, it's a good question because I guess I can answer it in a couple of different ways. There are ways in which people mm, inadvertently make something less usable because of misguided accessibility efforts. So it might be misunderstanding how a screen reader operates and putting tab focus in every piece of content on a web page because you think that in order to navigate through the web page, you need to press the tab key. And actually, a screen reader has many other keyboard commands that allow people to jump from heading to heading or paragraph to paragraph or from one form to another, whatever. So you end up making the page less usable by inadvertently adding accessibility features. So that's one way where people can make a mistake. I guess the other one would be, in this broad and diverse area of cognitive accessibility, where still there's less awareness of the things that people can do to improve accessibility. And cognitive accessibility addresses specific disabilities that affect the ability to read and process and remember information or focus, pay attention. And the ways that you can address those needs can also benefit many other people who might just find it difficult to use an interface and making it easier to understand and support people in making the right decision and recovering when they make the wrong decision. It can the benefits of cognitive accessibility affect people with cognitive disabilities and so often lots and lots of other people. So the more that we pay attention to that, then the more usable the interface that we can have. And the sort of issues are something might be it might cause some friction for some people, and then for somebody else, it's an almost an insurmountable barrier that they just give
Yeah.
up.
I think that's a really, I'm glad you brought that up, and largely because this is the area that I fall into, right? And I think it's because I'm dyslexic and have ADD. But I think it's really difficult for people to understand because we have this general category of cognitive disabilities. However, how you accommodate, the variety of ways that, people may be affected because of their cognitive disability is unbelievable. It's not as straightforward as vision or hearing. If you can't hear, you need text equivalent or you need some other way to convey information other than sound. And if you do that, you're probably in pretty good shape and that user is going to experience that in the right way. Or if you have a vision disability, you either need magnification or you need things to be spoken, right? So it's kind of, I don't want in any way to paint the picture of that stuff being simplistic, but when with neurodiversity or cognitive disabilities, that spectrum is so long that something that may help me may not even begin to be what somebody else needs. And I love the way that you put that, right? Blending the cognitive accessibility with usability in your example, because one of the things I think about, this is how I would relate that to me, David, is that in order for me to operate well in my workday, I need spell check.
Mhm.
Period. Right? I still have anxiety handwriting things because of when I was a kid and I would write on the board and misspell words and how That would be so spell check for me, writing email and stuff. It's like incredibly necessary, but it's a part of usability for everybody because while my spelling may be really not very good because of my dyslexia, everybody's going to misspell a word, right? And that spell check helps everybody. So and I know that's not quite usability, but just in that assistive technology that everybody
Hmm.
uses, it is an example where something that is absolutely critical for me is really, really nice for the whole anybody that's
Yeah.
writing papers and doing business and all those kind of things. So I think it's a really good area to really show that intersection between usability and accessibility.
Yeah, I love the fact that you brought up assistive technology because again, we're talking about a spectrum of user needs and the impact when those user needs are not met. And people with cognitive, certain cognitive disabilities might encounter a barrier that prevents access. Um, and for others, it might be a barrier that's noticed and is a bit of a roadblock, causes some friction. But with persistence, or maybe on the right day, or the wind's blowing in the right direction, yeah, I can overcome that. That's okay. Or maybe it's a minor thing, but for some people, it's a barrier that stops use. And then assistive technology that could help somebody overcome a barrier. And it might be something like autocomplete or some way to help somebody make a decision or provide clarification. Maybe it's, here's some choices, but here's an opportunity to access a definition or a glossary to explain terms in a choice that allows me to decide which to choose from, or the fact that I make a choice and I go to a point, I know I can reverse my decision, just that ability to undo a critical decision. That there's a requirement for that in WCAG, and that helps people recover from errors, but it also might be the difference between somebody deciding to progress rather than saying, I just don't even want to go any further. I'm so concerned that if I make this decision, it's irreversible, and I've lost out financially, or I've made a legal commitment that I wasn't sure about.
Hmm.
So again, that kind of
Which I do
any
all the
support you can provide.
Yeah, and I do that all the time. I mean, you're not talking about something it's that's I all the time go, nope, not taking the next step, or this is already more trouble than it's worth. I'm moving on to something
Hmm.
else.
Hmm.
And that's probably without, that's got to be doubled down on for
Right,
somebody who's experiencing a barrier because they have they're using assistive technology or something like that.
right. And
So,
then there's a kind of flip side of that, and I know our colleague Dave Swallows worked a lot on exploring anxiety and handling anxiety and stress in UX design, and there have been some really good examples from financial institutions that are, recognizing that some people, maybe with bipolar disorder, people with depression or other mental health conditions, that might, maybe late at night make a high value purchase using their credit card, and that's something that they might wake up in the morning and think, I didn't want to do that. I shouldn't have done that. And their banks will hold the charge rather than, because it happened in the middle of the night, the banks said, are you sure you want to make this charge? We've not processed the payment. Just wanted to double check. So it's a way, and it's not necessarily something that's required by accessibility standards, but it's a really sensitive way to addressing
mhm.
specific needs and accommodating those and enhancing usability as a way to recover from a decision that maybe somebody made in the spur of the moment, and later on would come to regret.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I don't have a lot of anxiety, but I imagine that there's people that do when it comes to these things. And I think about, what you're talking about, like banking and financial purchases. And I mean, even just, if you think about online banking and looking at your account and how important something like that is. You know, that's your life savings, or your nest egg, or your
Yep.
paycheck, or your, and if you are uncertain with something that important, that, I mean, it can cause a level of anxiety for anybody, but if you have a cognitive, you know, propensity towards that anxiety, that's going to be even worse. I mean, I've always just dealt with stuff with nope. Like that movie, Nope.
Hmm.
Like that's me on,
Hmm.
using technology. Like I hit points and just go, nope. And
Yep.
that may mean, nope, I'm calling a person. You've made this too confusing, too difficult. I'm just going to call somebody. Oh, we'd like to remind you it's easier and twice as fast on our website. Nope. I tried that and you confused me and I'm out, right?
Yeah.
I had my healthcare provider just the other day. I had tried to make a request over the portal and use the portal like everybody wants you to. And somebody on the phone said, yeah, our portal doesn't work very well. We don't like the way it works. It's really difficult for people to use, and it's going to be replaced. But there you go, right? Like that's usability in a nutshell. This was so difficult and caused so many problems and so much confusion. And I did this, and it didn't give me a confirmation. Like I had no idea. Like it was
Hmm.
really poor. And I think that's to your point, reeling it all the way back to the front of the conversation, that's the kind of thing that if we're wondering what is this day for and what needs to be improved, well, there you go, right?
Yeah.
If I make a request on my healthcare portal, please, confirm it. Let me know. Give me some information. How long will this take to fulfill? Whatever. It can't go into a void, and that's just the beginning of it. So I think that you're absolutely, and that causes a amount of distress, because I thought something happened that didn't happen. And again, if I had a propensity towards anxiety or confusion or whatever, like, everybody processes and experiences things differently. That can turn into something that's incredibly difficult for
Yeah.
lots of
Yeah.
people. Yeah.
So before I forget, I need to give a shout out to the Making Content Usable resource. And we talked a lot about this overlap between accessibility for cognitive accessibility needs and usability. And the W3C resource, Making Content Usable. So it's w3.org/tr/COGA, COGA hyphen usable, is a really good resource with some usability focused recommendations that if followed will help to make it easier for people with a variety of cognitive accessibility needs to use digital products. So definitely recommend people reference that in design and development.
Oh, that's a really good call out. That's a really good call out, because that's the other thing is, it's great that we're sitting here talking about this, David, but people need resources to
Yeah.
get to the next level. And on that same note, I always think about this in terms of, when we think about usability, it's not just a mental exercise where you go, I'm going to make this work better. You actually have to poll your audience, right? You have to do some testing, and you have to say, hey, I tried to make this better. Let's see how it works. So that testing piece is so important. Can you just talk a little bit about testing in this context as well?
Absolutely can. And probably I could talk for the rest of the day about user research more broadly. It's a
You go
subject
get a
close to
cup of
my heart.
coffee then.
Yeah, get your dinner and bring it back. I'm going to be here all day. Um,
Call in a pizza.
yeah, no,
If
this is
the app is
something
usable, I'll call in a pizza. If not, we're in trouble.
exactly. Yeah, do some testing with it. Yeah, you can do all of the standards-based conformance testing that you're able to do, but the true judge of whether somebody can use a product is watching them try to use the product for its intended purpose and noting where they have difficulties. But even before that, I mean, we talk a lot about involving users in testing, but better is to start by talking to users about needs before you start building the product. Understand how do
Requirements
people,
based.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's like figuring out, from your user's perspective, including people with disabilities, how do you currently perform these tasks? If you have an existing website or app, watch them use the current one to figure out where you need to make improvements for a new one. If you haven't built anything, then figuring out how do people approach the task, what are the biggest pain points, what are the things that are kind of, nah, that's not really a problem. Yeah, it happens, but I get over it. That's not a priority for me as a something you need to fix. And then ideally, participatory design. So you're involving users, including people with disabilities, throughout the design and development process. So they're almost partners in the process. But even if all of the only involvement with users that you have is at the end when you're doing usability evaluation, it's still better than doing nothing. And even one person is better than none, as long as you know that that is one person as opposed to somebody who's
Right.
representative of every person who presents with the same disability or the same profile. But absolutely involving people and observing, instead of saying, what do you think of this? More, okay, I'd like you to perform this task. I'm going to observe you doing it and then ask you some questions about what you did afterwards. It's still a great way to get really rich information about what to fix, what you need to fix and what priority to associate with the
Do
fixes that
that.
are needed. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that I like your point about coming in at the requirements phase. It seems like that sort of like gets you halfway down the road, so you only have like half the distance to travel once you come in and actually say, okay, now I've created this. How's it going now? Let me watch you use it now. Instead of being so far behind,
Yeah.
or having so much work to do once you've built it out and once you have people test it, and then you realize, oh wow, man, we really missed the mark here.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and I would imagine that there's an ROI associated with that too. Like that doing it in requirements phase just seems like it would be such an important thing to do. The more you can take care of there, just the much easier it's going to be.
Yeah. It helps you understand the problem space without assumptions that you haven't tested,
Hmm.
and it avoids you investing in solving the wrong problems or or maybe solving the right problems but in the wrong way. And we know that a lot of organizations find it really difficult to get the user perspective up front. But if anyone is out there doing some upfront user research, including people with disabilities in that, helps you get that perspective you get that accessibility angle, but you're also, you're including these are more people who are potentially users of your product and can be advocates for your product if it's designed with their needs in mind. So, I really believe in the value of
Hmm.
doing upfront research. And then, yeah, ideally through, as long as those needs are preserved and prioritized through the design development process, when it comes to evaluating, you're kind of verifying that your efforts were effective rather than discovering that your efforts were misguided and created problems.
So you're making me think, like, if we go back to the earlier part of our conversation where we were talking about being used to using something in a certain way, and then when it changes, if it's if the usability is not great, it could take us a long time to learn how to use it again, and kind of the how difficult that is. When you're doing usability studies, how much is that phenomenon a factor? So in other words, if somebody really is used to doing something in a certain way, could that bias that usability output either because they're extra frustrated because it doesn't work the way they're used to in air quotes, or they go, oh no, this works great for me because they're already used to that flow for whatever reason.
Yeah,
Like, is that a consideration, or is that, am I just,
I think it should be. I think this because we provide usability consultancy, we tend to get brought in to evaluate a product that we're not familiar with because it's a client product and their participants haven't used it before. So unless we've intentionally recruited people who are regular users of the product, but in most cases it's people who are unfamiliar with the product. So
So sort of
um,
fresh-eyed.
so they tend to be fresh perspectives, and I think we'd want to try and tease out, discussing behaviors or discussing, especially where somebody went wrong or if somebody had no problems, you know, can you explain why you found it so straightforward? And if they said, well, yeah, this is what I would always do when I was
I love
trying to order a pizza or whatever it is I'm doing. So
I got you thinking about pizza.
I know, I'm hungry already.
Oh,
So yeah, figuring out, you're learning about sort of learned behaviors, and using prior experiences is a really good way to sort of explore if somebody didn't have a problem, was it because we're following an established pattern and that's a good thing, let's keep doing that, or we deviated from a common pattern and that's why somebody got into difficulty.
interesting. Well, we're getting to the point where we have to wrap things up. We did it again,
Yep.
Dr. Sloan. Another State of Accessibility podcast successful. Any last minute thoughts or anything anything we may have should have said that we haven't said up to this point?
No, I think just the overall rallying cry that on World Usability Day, accessibility is nothing without usability, and
Hmm.
people with disabilities want usable products just like everyone else. So let's not separate the two, even though organizationally accessibility might be handled in legal compliance or
Right.
DEIA. Uh, it's all part of the goal to make usable and useful products to everyone. So let's treat it as a single focus and a single goal.
Well said. Great way to wrap things up. And happy World Usability Day. Now you know the state of accessibility. I am Mark Miller, thanking David Sloan and reminding you that the state of accessibility is always changing. So please help us affect change.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone.